On the 28th of April 1945, against the side of a road near to Lake Como, one of the most important people of the Second World War was slaughtered and executed by being shot by an Italian partisan. Benito Mussolini was a long-standing dictator of Italy, who would during the Second World War ally himself closely with Hitler and the Nazis. Mussolini and Hitler were very good friends, but ultimately the Italian war effort during the Second World War was not the most effective, and Mussolini would then be ousted from power, and he became a prisoner who was then broken out of his imprisonment by Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favourite commando. But Mussolini's downfall was sharp, and then after his execution his corpse and remains were taken into a square in Milan, where they were then displayed in front of thousands of people. The people showed their anger and discontent, and they shouted abuse at his remains as they were hanged upside down, and they would also spit and throw and punch the remains of the former dictator and his mistress, who was executed with him. But Mussolini was a man who Hitler idolised, and he eventually would fly too close to the sun, and because of this he was slain. Join us today as we look at the ruthless execution of Benito Mussolini, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Benito Mussolini had been serving as the leader of Italy since 1922, and he was the Prime Minister before he became dictator, and the fascist leader would take the country to war during the Second World War, despite the fact many of his generals would speak out and warn about the strength of the Italian army and forces. The Italians became part of the Axis alliance. They were major players in this, allying themselves with the German army and the Wehrmacht and the Nazis. Mussolini would also want to conquer for himself, and he wanted to expand the Italian Empire too, and his forces would launch attacks on Greece. They would also support the Germans in battles in North Africa. But the battles here saw thousands of Italian soldiers killed and also captured, and their escapades there alongside the Germans were in vain, as they would be defeated. Italian soldiers were also sent to Russia during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and many would not come home. In Italy, some dissenting people believed that the Italian soldiers were fighting a war that they did not need to be involved in, and some began to question Mussolini and his leadership. His leadership would be considered weak at times, especially following the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and Mussolini was then deposed, and he was placed under arrest before the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies. The Grand Fascist Council would vote him out, and many of his former allies, friends and even family members would turn against him, and for Mussolini this was a big kick in the teeth. Because of this, Mussolini would then be imprisoned, and he was held in many different sites around Italy to make sure he could not be broken out by people loyal to him. But Hitler would formulate a raid and a plan around this, and the Gran Sasso raid took place, and this saw Otto Skorzeny's commandos free Mussolini, and he was then moved. Mussolini was grateful to Hitler that he had been freed, but he was then placed in control of the newly established Italian Social Republic, a German puppet state set up in the north of Italy. But the Allies continued to fight with Italy, and they would capture many important Italian cities such as Rome. They would then push north. Mussolini then moved to Milan with the final parts of his loyalist army, but the end was then on the horizon. With this, Mussolini considered what was next, and the Germans had retreated out of the northern Italian cities, and the Italian partisan leadership were running elements of the country, and they stated that any member of former fascist governments was to be sentenced to death when they were captured. There were peace negotiations between partisans and Mussolini's representatives, but these came to nothing, and on the 25th of April 1945, Mussolini was desperate and he fled towards Lake Como. He was trying to head for the Swiss border, and he would be denied entry, but he was part of a Wehrmacht transport and convoy and was on the run with his life in the balance. The previous declaration would have meant that when he was captured, he would have been executed, but on the 26th of April, Mussolini and his mistress would try to get into Switzerland again. If he would have been allowed to cross the border, then he would have been saved, but this would not happen, and he then made the decision to try and get to Germany. On the 27th of April 1945, a group of local partisans attacked the convoy in which Mussolini and his mistress were travelling in. This was near to the village of Dongo. The convoy came to a halt and a stop, and inside the convoy were other former fascist politicians. The partisans arrested many of these people, and to begin with they did not find Mussolini. The Germans gave over all of the Italians and then found hiding in one of the vehicles was a former fascist dictator, and one witness said that his face was like wax and his stare glassy. I read exhaustion but not fear. He seemed spiritually dead. Mussolini was then placed under arrest, and he was then taken to a nearby barracks that evening and was reunited with his mistress early in the morning of the 28th of April. There was a lot of fighting going on around the prison where he was held, and people believed that he would be rescued, and for this he was moved yet again. It was announced to the people of Italy on Radio Milano that Benito Mussolini had been captured, and it was said that, "We think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." Mussolini would then be sentenced to death, and it's not known specifically who ordered this. It was claimed that the communist leader, Luigi Longo from Milan, would order the death of Mussolini, and he would dispatch the executioner, Walter Ordizio, to go and shoot him. Ordizio went with another partisan, Aldo Lampredi, to carry out the mission and shooting. But there are different versions of his execution, and he would be executed alongside his mistress, Clara Patasci. The two executioners left Milan for Dongo in the early hours of the 28th of April, and they were armed with their weapons to execute Mussolini. When they got there, they secured Mussolini as a prisoner and his mistress. They were allowed to then move the pair. Ordizio hid his real identity and said he was Colonnello Valerio during the execution, and he picked Mussolini up from the farmhouse. He and Patasci, his mistress, were then driven to a village named Giulio de Zamegra, and the vehicle came to a stop outside of a villa named the Villa Belamonte. This was on a narrow road, and Mussolini and Patasci were ordered to get out of the car, then stand against a wall. The pair may have believed that they were being imprisoned and held there at the villa, but at 4:10 p.m, Walter Ordizio took out his machine gun, and he shot Mussolini and Patasci against the wall of the villa. There are differing accounts as what happened with the execution, and Ordizio claimed that Mussolini died a coward, and that he wept as the death sentence was read. The assistant with Ordizio claimed that this was different, and he said that Mussolini did not cry, and instead ordered the executioners to shoot at his heart. Other accounts do exist, which say he was even shot by a firing squad, but it's clear that the execution was carried out quickly. But following the death of Benito Mussolini, there would be more shocking scenes in Italy. His corpse, along with his mistresses, would be taken to Milan. They were then dumped in the Piazza Loreto, which was a major market square. There had been executions of partisans taken place there before, and the bodies of Mussolini and Patasci were then placed on public display. By 9 a.m. in the morning, a huge crowd of angry partisans had gathered in the square. They would spit at, urinate on, kick and throw things at the body of Mussolini and his mistress. The face of Mussolini was heavily disfigured by its ordeal, and the crowd was lawless and out of control. The bodies were then placed on a half-built petrol station frame, and the corpses were hung upside down on meat hooks. This was done as a final act of disgrace, and it was also done to protect the bodies a little bit. But at 2 p.m. on the 29th of April 1945, the Americans arrived, and they then ordered the bodies to be cut down. They were then taken to a morgue for an autopsy. One autopsy showed that Mussolini had been shot with 9 bullets from a submachine gun, and another said he had been shot 7 times. 4 bullets at his heart had been fatal and killed him, and after this Mussolini was then buried in an unmarked grave, but fascists would later exhume him and would steal and hide his body. There was a huge effect caused by Mussolini's death and also his posthumous display. This was, Hitler learned about how his remains and body had been treated, and because of this Hitler then took steps to ensure that his body and his wives' bodies would not fall into the hands of his enemies. He would order his body to be burned, but the Mussolini situation and execution would influence Hitler's decision to die by his own hand, and not by the bullets of his enemies. But Mussolini's execution was hastily arranged and was quickly carried out and was ruthless. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.